It's my great privilege to join you today. I'm sorry I'm not with you, sort of, if you like, live for the event. I have, unfortunately, a throat infection. But I did want to send a message of solidarity to Chinese lawyers. And I wanted to encourage everyone who's a lawyer in other parts of the world to recognize the importance of standing alongside our colleagues in the law who take such brave positions in China. Now, my name is Helena Kennedy, and I am the director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. The persecution of lawyers is unfortunately a common theme across the overt and indeed even in covert authoritarian regimes operating around the world, with the rule of law and its enforcement being the foremost universal check and balance mechanism to ensure the accountability of governments. Understanding the motivations behind the repressive treatment of lawyers is not difficult. Repressive governments go after them because it's lawyers who expose authoritarian regimes and their practices against the citizens of a nation. If the rule of law is the heart of the legal system, lawyers are its limbs. And thus the targeted subjugation of lawyers is of particular concern in the East Asian regions of China and Hong Kong. The increasingly cataclysmic atmosphere China has fostered in Hong Kong is rendered all the more concerning by the pattern of persecution of Chinese lawyers undertaking their professional duties, both in Hong Kong and in mainland China. The 9th of July marks the 6th anniversary of the 709 crackdown, a state-sponsored campaign devised to persecute Chinese human rights lawyers and other advocates, during which over 200 lawyers were detained, were tortured, arrested, and forcibly disappeared. The offensive was orchestrated to essentially intimidate an entire generation of lawyers into silent submission. 6 years on, the landscape for lawyers practicing in China, namely for human rights lawyers, remains hostile, dangerous, and wholly repressive. As of late 2019, the political prisoner database of the Congressional Executive Commission of China recorded 1,598 cases of political prisoners. Although they have noted that the true figure is considerably higher. Of those 1,598 prisoners, over 100 are lawyers. Prior to and since this last documenting period, there have been numerous reports of lawyers being detained under baseless and vague charges, such as inciting subversion of state power. These lawyers are then remanded in custody for oftentimes monstrously long periods of duration. One such illustration of the systemic abuse of lawyers and their rights by Chinese authorities is the case of the human rights lawyer Wu Sheng. Wu Sheng, after having been arrested in 2018, was held in pretrial detention for over 500 days for allegedly inciting subversion of state power. He then underwent a secret trial of which neither his family nor his defense lawyer were notified. It saw him sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. After having been denied visitation for over 3 years, Wu Sheng's wife was finally able to have a video call with him. I recently took part in a webinar with his wife. It was very moving. She reported that she noticed a tremor in his hand, that his hand was shaking. And she feared that some damage had been done to him, which meant that he was suffering neurological damage. She also noticed that several of his teeth were missing, and that clearly that was a result of probably a physical punching into his face. And she knew that he was suffering from internal ailments. He had lost weight, his face was drawn, and and he complained of stomach problems. Wu Sheng's story, although harrowing, is not unique. Secret trials have become increasingly the order of the day. Despite the overt violation of the right to a fair trial under international law and the mandated opening of all trials to the public under domestic law, which is actually in Chinese law, and I'll turn to that in a minute. Similarly, denial of visitation, a constant in Chinese jails, families not given access to their family member who's detained, poor prison conditions, and torture or ill treatment. They remain abundantly prominent, as can be devised from anecdotal evidence, and I have no reason to doubt it. For those lawyers who have not been imprisoned, Chinese authorities have inserted themselves and their intimidation tactics into their lives, into the very interstices of everyday life after heavy government surveillance. This threat extends itself to the families of human rights defenders and lawyers who are routinely threatened. They're summoned for questioning, subjected to surveillance by the authorities, and socioeconomically affected on account of the loss of income to the household. There has also been an increased reliance on the suspension or revocation of lawyers' licenses. This is a common thing in authoritarian regimes, that they take away the license to operate as a lawyer. And so it's a less draconian way, but it's still an important way of subverting the rights and freedoms, not just of those in the legal profession, but of those who need access to justice in the general public. Attacking the lawyers attacks access to justice. And there's also been increased use of residential surveillance at a designated location, RSDL. And it's used against lawyers and human rights defenders, as this form of incarceration, it's like house arrest, is much less governed and much more clandestine. RSDL is an extrajudicial measure, and there's no requirement for a court order, and it can often be imposed before arrest, and is so invasive of the privacy and intimacy of the home. Lawyers are often detained under Article 40 of the Lawyers' Practice Management Measures, which states that lawyers shall not publish or disseminate statements that negate the fundamental political system and basic principles established by the Constitution or that endanger national security. They shall not use the internet or the media to provoke opposition to the party and to the government. So they're not allowed to talk about their cases or the ways in which the state might be abusing their clients. So one of the things that has happened is that many of us in other parts of the world who've spoken out have ourselves experienced incursions into our own freedom. I myself, as someone who has spoken out about the treatment of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, and about the treatment of people subjected to human rights abuse within China, have been placed on a targeted sanctions list. Now, that was simply for freedom of expression. I, as a parliamentarian, had spoken out about what I saw as being abuses of human rights, and as a result, I'm not allowed to visit Hong Kong, Taiwan, China. And I have no hostility to the Chinese people. What I'm concerned about is the abuses perpetrated against them by their state. But now I cannot visit or travel there. I cannot have any interest there, and nor can my family. This came about partly because we were calling upon, a number of us politicians were calling upon our legislature to be concerned about abuses of human rights and to make it part of our consideration in trading with mainland China, because it's the only leverage that we have, and we wanted our government to use it. But because we spoke out in Parliament, we have been subject to targeted sanctions by the Chinese government. China is bound both by international law and domestic law to ensure and practice the protection of lawyers from harassment, threat, arbitrary detention, and torture on the basis of lawful activities conducted in a professional capacity. And I just want you to know that the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute considers the protection of lawyers and our concerns about for lawyers at risk is of the utmost importance in our work. Much of our programming is directed at supporting lawyers who are at risk around the world. And here, of course, we're talking about in China. It's one, as I say, of our priorities. We're greatly involved in UN advocacy programs and a particular one concerning China. And we stand ready to collaborate with states and with civil society on this issue of protecting lawyers, because without lawyers, you cannot get justice in societies. The Constitution of the People's Republic of China is, in fact, in many ways, an example of law that exists on paper, but not in practice. That constitution and peripheral legislation guarantee several fundamental human rights, including the right of freedom of speech and association. It's within the Chinese constitution at Article 35. People have due process rights, the right to a fair trial and the right to counsel under Article 125 of the Chinese constitution. And the compulsory opening of all trials to the public is referred to within the Constitution. And it's supposed to be that it's only in the most exceptional of circumstances, provided for in law, that they would close a court, and that would be where it was concerning matters of real secrecy, where it would be of concern to the national security if the court was open. In countries that does exist, it exists even in Britain, but very rarely used, and it's only used for those bits of the evidence which would be about matters of international secrecy that one wouldn't want shared with potential enemies. That's not the normal things of being able to use and exercise freedom of speech, and that's not a good enough reason for closing down a trial to public scrutiny. Article 37 of the Lawyer's Law of the People's Republic of China provides that a lawyer's right of the person is inviolable and affirms that a lawyer is not legally liable for the positions that he or she presents on a client's behalf. It also provides for the notification of family members and legal representative at the arrest and detention of an individual should be made available within 24 hours of the execution of the detention or of the arrest. Well, it certainly didn't happen for many of the lawyers of whom I'm speaking today. And it certainly didn't happen for the lawyer whose wife I met at an international event where we spoke together. The non-notification of family members is another real concern because of the fear that it creates in families for what has happened to the people that they love. China's ongoing persecution of lawyers is a further breach of their obligations under international conventions and customary international law. Article 16 of the UN Basic Principles on the Role of Lawyers provides that governments shall ensure that lawyers are able to perform all their professional functions without intimidation, hindrance, harassment, or improper interference. Article 18 of the UN Basic Principles provides that lawyers shall not be identified with their clients or their clients' causes as a result of discharging their functions. So representing someone who has made a protest or so on should not be a cause for arresting that lawyer. Article 10 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal, and so on and so on. We know that people need to have lawyers and need to have independent and fearless lawyers act for them, whatever the nature of the allegation by the state. So it goes without saying that the practices of Chinese authorities against lawyers are in direct violation of the principles of the rule of law and of the independence of lawyers and of the judiciary. And so I say to everyone, it's our duty to speak out about what is happening and to do so fearlessly and to stand with our colleagues in China, because free societies need free lawyers and need free judges and need those rights to be protected. Thank you all, and I wish you luck.